Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Paul Harrison and I'm a director at Christian Safeguarding Services. And the aim of this webinar is just to give you a very brief introduction to the latest guidance from government, from the Department for Education, which relates to organisations who provide services to children and young people, but who aren't covered by the Ofsted framework. This new guidance has literally just hit us. We've literally worked around the clock just to analyse it, to work out what it's saying, make sure we're understanding that, and we're getting this initial webinar out to you quickly. The aim really of this webinar is just to make you aware of the existence of the guidance, and so we're going to give you a brief introduction. We're going to explain how it relates to churches and other faith-based organisations. There's a few general issues that we want to draw to your attention, things that are just worth noting as you consider the implications of this guidance. We're going to take a quick look at what your next steps need to be, and we're also going to point you to where there is further information that will help you to respond positively and constructively to this guidance. Back in 2018, December 2018, the Department for Education published a consultation. At the time, the title was talking about safeguarding in out of school settings, and that consultation ran. There was also some accompanying guidance that was for parents that was being consulted on at the same time. And that consultation took place. Many of us responded. It may be that you personally did. I know we certainly gave our thoughts on that guidance at the time. That's been in the government machine for a little while now, and government have obviously been working away on it behind the scenes, as it were. And as of the 21st of October, they have signed off the actual finished version of this guidance. This is quite a milestone document in the sense that what it's doing is that for the first time we have guidance which is specifically aimed at organisations like ourselves. Previously, those of you who have attended training with us in the past, for example, will know that what we have been doing is we've been working together to safeguard children, which continues to be statutory guidance for us. But in the absence of any more specific guidance, we've been working with keeping children safe in education as the standard that we have been working to. And then we try to translate that into the church context. What this guidance is doing is giving us some guidance that is very specifically aimed at smaller organisations, perhaps, and it certainly impacts on churches. That there are impacts that we need to take into account. So we're really pleased that this guidance is now available. We think it's helpful, and we think it will help churches. For some of you, in fact, it won't make a great deal of difference because you're already doing the things that are required. For others of you, it might just highlight some areas where you can further strengthen the church's witness and the church's good standing through good safeguarding. Now, the guidance as it stands, there are various documents. 3 of those are specifically relevant to us as churches. Another 3, which I'm going to mention them in passing. They may be helpful to you depending on the activities that you run, but they're not as directly relevant. The first and the main one of these is the actual guidance itself. This is the document. It is, I think, 52 pages long, 54 if you count the back cover. That's the actual guidance, and this is the main document that we need to be taking into account. There are a couple of supplementary pieces of guidance that work alongside that. One is a piece of guidance for tutoring activities run by faith groups, and obviously that has direct implications for us. And then there's a further publication which is aimed at parents, and the idea of this document is it helps parents to assess what does a good quality setting look like. So all of these pieces of guidance are going to be of significance to us. In addition to that, there are three other documents. One of these is aimed at volunteers, another of these is aimed at lone practitioners, and the third is aimed at a sporting context, organisations who are involved in sporting activities. And so they're the suite of documents that are available. Now, obviously, the three that are of importance to us are the main guidance, the main document itself, the small supplementary guidance for faith groups, and then the one that is talking to parents about how do they assess what does a good quality setting look like. Now, the first thing that we need to understand here is what's the status of this guidance. This guidance is referred to as non-statutory guidance. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that it is not legally enforceable. Okay, it is guidance. I know this gets confusing because working together to safeguard children is classed as being guidance, and yet we would treat that as being a legal requirement. The reason is that working together is what we refer to as statutory guidance. In other words, statutory guidance has to be issued by law, by a department or by a Secretary of State in order to give clear instructions to organisations. They refer to it as guidance because there are some circumstances where we can deviate from that, where there is good reason. But in general, it's essentially to be treated as being a legal requirement. So that's statutory guidance. This particular guidance is non-statutory. In other words, it's voluntary. It's there really to help providers of clubs, of activities for children and young people. It's there to help them to understand what does good practice look like. How do we create a safe environment for children? What are the kinds of things that we should have in place? In other words, there is no. We're being told that there's not going to be any kind of a sort of regulatory regime here. There's not going to be any sort of inspections or anything of that nature. It is voluntary guidance. But that said, it is guidance that's been issued on the basis of things that we've learnt over the years in terms of what works well in safeguarding. And it's also going to describe for us what government will expect of us, what local services will expect of us as churches. So, for example, if we were to have an allegation against one of our volunteers, these are the kinds of things that the local authority are going to expect that we have got in place in order to deal with things like that. The second thing that it aims to do, first, is that it helps us as organisations to make sure we're creating safe environments. The second thing that it does, and this I think is going to become increasingly significant over the coming months, is that it helps parents, it sort of builds confidence in parents to understand what they should be looking for and what questions they should be asking of those who are taking care of their children. Now, this is part of a bigger strategy on the part of government. I think it's a very positive strategy. It's encouraging parents really to check carefully. If I'm going to leave my children with this group, are they safe? Are they putting in place appropriate measures to make sure that my child is kept safe? And so we can see this positively, not negatively. Who is the guidance for? It refers, as I've already said in the title, to community activities that are happening in the community, after school clubs, tuition, these kinds of things. What we need to understand is this is a very broad piece of guidance. It's not specifically written for churches, it's not specifically written for your context, it's not even specifically written in that sense for the voluntary sector, although a lot of organisations who will access it will be voluntary sector organisations. But it's not necessarily restricted to the voluntary sector. It's really aimed at anybody who is providing activities for children outside of the regulatory framework that sits in place for schools. And so it might be community activities, fun activities, anything of that nature that would come under this guidance. Tuition. That, of course, might be academic tuition. It might be a tutor who's helping a young person, maybe to prepare for exams or something like that. But it could equally be any sort of informal tuition, so photography classes that were aimed at children, these kinds of things. Training, that might be sports training. It might be sort of drama and arts type training, or it could be religious training. Instruction, it also covers that, and out of school clubs. And so this is about anybody who really is working with children in any kind of a formal context. I mean, that's the bottom line. If you have a group that is aimed at children and young people, this guidance is aimed specifically for you. Now, when we talk about an out-of-school setting, we've already sort of described the broad span of that, but there are certain exclusions, and those exclusions are organisations who already sit under the regulatory framework that is provided via Ofsted. And so the definition is that it's any organisation that is providing community activities, tuition, training, instruction, out-of-school clubs, but are not a school, or a college, an educational setting providing alternative provision. So that might be a pupil referral unit, or it might be a specialist training that is provided for children of school age, 16 to 19 academies, or Ofsted registered childcare. Those don't count. They're excluded from this, and the reason for that is very simply that they already have a regulatory framework. That regulatory framework is significantly more robust. It's a bit more demanding than the framework that we have here. And so this is essentially saying, look, for those organisations working with children and young people who don't have to register with Ofsted, what we want to do is set some minimum standards, things that you really ought to be aiming for to make sure that children and young people are safe. I think one of the things that we really do need to understand very clearly is that a setting in this context, we're talking about out of school settings, or we're talking about activities, it doesn't matter where that activity is delivered. It might be that your church has a building and you're delivering those services from your church building. But it could just as easily be a community centre. It could be a football pitch, or an outdoor activity centre where there's a climbing wall, or the location doesn't matter. It's the activity that matters. And it also covers tuition that is provided in someone's home. So, for example, if you are a music teacher and you teach children in your home, then you are covered by this guidance. And so the venue is not what matters. What matters is the activity, and that the activity is provided for children and young people. Of course, we continue to use the standard definition of a child in this context. When we talk about children and young people, we're talking about anybody up to their 18th birthday. Okay. So, as we look at the list of what is meant, what's covered by this, there is one of the categories that is specifically quoted as being within scope of this guidance, and that is religious settings. The guidance says that within scope are religious settings offering education in their own faith, culture, religious texts, or preparation for rites of passage. Christian Sunday schools are specifically mentioned within their guidance at that point. And so, although this is guidance that isn't aimed specifically at Christians, it's certainly not aimed specifically at Christians, it's not aimed at the faith community in more general sense. It's aimed at any organisation who is working with children and young people. Well, what are the main themes, the main drivers, if you like, behind this particular guidance? Well, the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that it's written in plain English. That's been very deliberate. One of the things that came out in the consultation was that some of the language was slightly technical, and that some of the people who would be required to follow the guidance may not understand some of that language. And so it really has been written for people who don't have a background in safeguarding, for people who aren't experts in that field, they're not trained in safeguarding professionally or anything of that nature. That's great. It's really helpful because it makes it very, very accessible. But of course, it does have the flip side, which is that sometimes in explaining things in non-technical language, it might at times mean that a greater volume of information is having to be provided. And also, there are some things where if you have a technical understanding of something, in other words, if you're involved in the safeguarding world professionally, you might just need to check that you're understanding it correctly, because sometimes the terminology is used slightly more generically rather than in a technical sense. But it's a plain English guide, which is great, and it's really helpful. What government want to do is to engage providers who perhaps haven't engaged with safeguarding as thoroughly as they might have done in the past. Within this context, an organisation is literally anything from a one-person organisation. So an individual coach or tutor is covered by this guidance just as much as an organisation that's working maybe with thousands of volunteers, maybe operating nationally, maybe tens of thousands of volunteers that they're working with. So it covers everything from sort of uniformed organisations through informal organisations, right down to an individual coach or an individual tutor who's working with children and young people. And so what the guidance wants to do is to engage with everybody and say, we all have a duty to safeguard children. Now, that shouldn't be a great surprise to any churches. I think we have been aware for some significant time of our responsibilities to safeguard. As I've already indicated, many churches, when you pick up the guidance, you'll just kind of look through it and you'll say, well, yeah, we already do all of that stuff. And that's great. If you're a church maybe who hasn't stayed up to date with training, with safeguarding training, maybe you sort of put your policies in place back in the 2000s, in the early 2000s. Maybe you haven't reviewed your policy for the last few years. You haven't done any training for the last few years. Then certainly there may be some stuff coming in here that is new to you. But the idea here is that it's bringing everybody who's working with children and young people to a minimum standard. And I think that is the right way to regard this guidance. This is the minimum standard. Many of us will exceed this, and that's great, and that's what we want to do. But it is the minimum standard that we should be aiming for. But as well as engaging those of us who are providing services to children and young people, this programme is aiming to engage with parents. And I think this is going to become important. What government want is for parents to start to be much more proactive, much more informed in assessing, is this a safe place for me to leave my child? And so I don't imagine this will happen immediately and overnight, but I think what we can expect is that far more in the future we'll hopefully start to see parents asking meaningful questions. What's your safeguarding policy like? Who do we go to if we have concerns? These kinds of questions, I think, over time are likely to become perhaps much more commonplace than they are at the moment. At least that's what we hope will happen. That would, for me, would be a very positive move. And it's something that we want to see resulting from this, that across society we're taking safeguarding far more seriously. And it also is talking about our duty of care. Of course, as those who provide services for children and young people, maybe you run a kids club in the week, or you have a youth club, maybe you run a Sunday school, whatever it is, that we do have a duty to take reasonable steps to make sure that those children and young people are kept safe. So that's kind of what's driving this. It's the desire to learn from the past, to learn from the mistakes of the past, and to make sure that there's good quality safeguarding right across every activity that works with children and young people. The guidance itself covers four key themes. It did cover a fifth, which was finance, and that was dropped out of the guidance as a result of the consultation. And I think that's very helpful. It reduces the size of the guidance somewhat. And it allows us to keep a focus on those things that are directly related to keeping children safe, whereas the finance section that was in the original draft did feel a little bit out of place. So there are now four key areas, if you like, that government are saying we need to address. The four sections and the four areas that we need to think about are health and safety, safeguarding and child protection, suitability of staff and volunteers, and governance. Now, if you're up to date with your safeguarding training, if you're up to date with your understanding of safeguarding, none of those will come as any kind of a surprise to you. Some of those obviously are more at that universal end of safeguarding, but spreading them right the way through to that child protection. So if we think about that spectrum of safeguarding that we talk about, where we have universal safeguarding, targeted, specialist child in need, specialist child protection, this guidance is aiming to span the entire spectrum. And it's organised under those four headings. Within each heading, there are essentially three key subsections. The first one is a checklist. Very helpfully, government give us a list of things, and they say, if you are a volunteer, and here's the things you need to have in place. If you are a small organisation, less than 5 people, then here's the things that you need to have in place. And if you're a large organisation, which is defined as being 5 or more people involved in the organisation, then you need to have these additional things in place as well. And so the first part of each section is the checklist. What are the things that we need to have in place? And so we can very quickly assess where are we at. It wouldn't take many minutes at all if you've got a knowledge of what's going on within your organisation, within your church. It wouldn't take you very long to flick through that and to establish, are we okay? Have we got everything covered? Or would we need to do some work here? The next section is a more detailed guidance. That's the bulk of each of those 4 sections. The second subsection is the detailed guidance, and obviously depending on which area we're talking about, there is different content in there to help us to understand what our duties are in relation to that particular area. And then each section then closes off with some questions that parents may ask. Now, this is important. It's not there just out of curiosity. It's not a wild guess. As I've already mentioned, there is specific guidance for parents, and government are saying, look, if you're going to leave your children with someone to take care of, there are some basic things that you need to have in place. And so government are giving parents lists of questions that they might want to consider asking of an organisation before they leave their children with that organisation. And so what government do is that they provide us with the knowledge that we need to be prepared, so that when those parents ask those questions, we're ready for that and we're able to give a clear and a confident answer. Now, that's kind of the structure of the guidance. Initial impressions, as I say, we've had this for just about 24 hours now. And we've literally worked around the clock just to make an initial assessment of this. In terms of an initial assessment of the guidance, the content of this guidance is not new. And what's new is that the various pieces of information have been brought together into a concise and a coherent form in one place, so that rather than having to go to different places to look at requirements in these areas, looking at different pieces of legislation, different pieces of guidance that aren't necessarily coordinated and that aren't aimed at our context, The aim is to do away with that. In other words, it's not introducing new requirements on us. What it's doing is drawing together information that's scattered around in different places at present and bringing it all together into one place. And I think we can be grateful for that. I think that's a really helpful thing for us to have. Another message that comes through really, really clearly, very strongly, although the word that we have been using for a considerable amount of time is different to the one that is being used here. They don't actually use the word competence within the guidance, but they are talking about competence. They're saying that we need to be effective, that we need to make sure that we know what we're doing, that we need to make sure that we know what we have to have in place and how we're going to make sure that we meet those requirements. And it's talking about competence. Now, again, if you've done training of recent times, you will know that's not a new theme. We've been talking about competence for a good number of years. We at CSS have a freely available competency framework so that you can think about what are the things that different members of your team, whether they be staff or whether they be volunteers, what are the things that those people need to know about? So the idea of competence isn't new. The word isn't used actually in the guidance from what I can see, unless when I go through it with a fine-tooth comb over the next couple of days, unless I spot something that I've missed so far. But it's very, very much talking about competence. How do we make sure that our trustees understand their legal duties? How do we make sure that our safeguarding lead understands their duties? How do we make sure that our team leaders understand? How do we make sure that our volunteers and our staff understand their duties? And not just understand those things, but put that knowledge into practice. That's the difference, isn't it, between knowledge and competence? Again, if you've done training of recent times, you've probably heard this said. There's a difference between knowledge and competence. And for quite a few years now, our focus has been on competence, not on simply knowledge. The aim of this guidance is very, very clear, and we welcome that aim, because the aim of the guidance is to strengthen the culture around safeguarding within voluntary sector organisations or private organisations, but who are working in this area of providing out of school activities for children, for young people. And it's aiming to raise the quality of the safeguarding within those contexts. And that has to be a good thing. If you've been keeping an eye on what's been going on with the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, ICSA, I'm sure that even if you haven't been watching it closely, there will have been occasions where you have seen on the news articles about different things that have gone on. I know when the Archbishop of Canterbury was in, for example, there was a lot in the media about his responses in relation to sexual abuse within the church in the past, and these kinds of things. And this guidance really is about setting minimum standards and saying, anybody working with children and young people ought to be meeting these minimum standards. It's about thinking about the whole scope of safeguarding, the scope of safeguarding in the sense of what is it that we can contribute to this? The scope of safeguarding in the sense of understanding it's not just child protection, but it's safeguarding in that broadest sense. Thinking about safeguarding, not only how do we keep children safe while they're with us, but how do we spot indicators of abuse? How do we respond appropriately if we're concerned that something's happening outside of our control? It's about just making sure that we've got a real good understanding of what safeguarding is all about, and it's about expanding that competent base within the children's workforce, making sure that those who maybe have fallen through the cracks in the past are implementing these basic standards of systems, of processes, of behaviours that are required in order to keep children safe. I think one of the areas that we do need as churches to think about, I think one of the areas that does stand out for me, and this is an area perhaps that is a little bit newer. Now, I know that various churches have been thinking about this. We certainly cover it in our training, and we've had various conversations about this. But the notion of formal and informal activity within the church context, in other words, There are some activities that we run which we would recognise are church activities. Okay, um, you run a youth club, you run a Sunday school, you run a kids club, you run a holiday Bible club, whatever it may be, and often, we're clear about that. That's where our safeguarding policies are focused. We've got all the stuff in place for those activities. But what about those informal arrangements that come up? You see, within this guidance, what it's saying is that anybody who provides um, anybody who provides training or activities and so on, uh, even if they're just one person on their own, should be complying with this guidance. And so, as churches, one of the things that we are going to have to start to think through is that sort of informal arrangement where someone just organises an activity for the kids. Someone just organises a kick around with a football or whatever it may be. It's kind of not an official church activity, but now there are going to be expectations from that point of view. I think it's going to highlight issues for us about being really clear about what's an official activity and what's not an official activity. And so there are going to be some things that we do need to think through. There are issues that we need to think through around contextualisation. How do we make this relevant to our church context? That's going to be an important question for us. The guidance is much more helpful to us than the statutory guidance. It far more rigorously recognises, that we're not a school, we're not the NHS, we're not a local authority. We are a local church, and that we don't have the resources that some of those big organisations have. And I think from that point of view, it's very helpful. But this is literally covering anybody working with children and young people. It's covering the entire faith spectrum. It's covering sporting activities, arts-related activities. It doesn't matter what it is. Anything that sits outside of that Ofsted inspection framework is within scope of this particular guidance. And so it talks a lot, and it's this isn't a criticism. The guidance itself recognises that we're going to have to think about what's our context, what's proportionate for our context. That idea that we talk about a lot in training, are we coming up with a proportionate response here? Is written again and again in the guidance itself. And so we are still going to have to do some work, but the point here is that the start point is different. We're not taking guidance that's written for a school and then trying to say, well, how do we make that fit into a church context? No, this is much more tailored towards our context. The start point is much easier to work from, but there is still nonetheless the need to understand how does this work in our local context. So it's not a ready-made solution, albeit that it's much more contextualised than what we've had in the past. I think another thing for us to recognise about this guidance, and I do think very seriously that this is an issue that we need to take on board. Again, if you've done training with us over recent times, you'll know that we talk about those different standards. We talk about the fact that for many years, many churches have seen safeguarding as being a matter of legal compliance. Are we meeting our legal duties? Great, tick. That's that one done. Now we can move on and think about the important stuff for us as a church. And we have sought to challenge that view substantially. We don't believe that that's honouring to God, and of course some of you will know that I will say to you, do we really want to be aiming for a standard that is one step above criminality? Because of course, if we don't meet that standard, if we don't meet the standard of legal requirements, then immediately we are breaking the law. And so, is that the standard that we as churches think we should be aiming for? And of course, as you know, we have been encouraging churches to aim not even just for best practice, which is what we have here, but for a standard of safeguarding that is honouring to God, a standard of safeguarding that the Lord will say, well done, good and faithful servant, as it were, in relation to this particular aspect, which is important. It's not the be-all and end-all, and it certainly isn't the be-all and end-all. but which certainly is a minimum standard that we want to be aiming for. As I say, many churches will already be exceeding these standards, and that's great. This isn't something to say, oh, drop back to this level. But what it is saying is if you're not hitting this in its entirety, then you need to make sure that you're doing so because your environment isn't sufficiently safe for children and young people. So it is a basic minimum standard. It's a basic minimum standard informed by best practice, by good practice. It is above the minimum legal requirement level. But it certainly isn't something that we would want to say, oh, you don't need to worry about trying to sort of achieve better. It is, and the guidance itself makes it very clear that this is the basic level that is expected, but that actually we should be striving for still greater level of safety. The other thing, again, important to understand, this guidance doesn't replace anything else. What it does is draws together what is already in place in other legislation and other statutory guidance. And so we're not suggesting here that now you don't need to worry about working together to safeguard children. You do, that's the statutory guidance. But what this document does is it brings all of that together into one place, into a coherent form, so it makes it a lot easier for us to understand it and to work with it. And also, of course, it's written with lay people in mind rather than being written with professionals in mind. The final thing that I just want to say about this in terms of these key issues to consider is what is meant by a large provider. Now, this could be a little confusing if you don't read the guidance carefully. It is stated very clearly in the guidance if you read it carefully, but it could cause some confusion. When the guidance talks about large organisations, it is talking about an organisation who has 5 or more people working in it. Now, the first thing for us to say is that is not 5 or more employees. That would include volunteers. Okay, now of course, even what we would regard as being a relatively small church, if you're delivering a youth club and a kids club, or maybe you're delivering not even midweek activities for kids, but you've got a couple of groups on a Sunday in terms of Sunday school, the Bible class, that kind of thing, and you've got a pastor, the likelihood is you are already at that level. Because you're probably going to have a couple of volunteers in each group. You've got a pastor, that's 5 people. You're a large organisation by definition of this guidance. And so when you read large provider, please don't think large church. The vast majority of us will fit into that category of large provider. And so, yeah, just important to recognise that. The context here is that it's aimed at everybody from one person working on their own. And therefore, if you're an organisation which has multiple people working, we've got to be thinking through carefully, how do we make sure all of our volunteers know the processes, know the systems, are following the systems, etc. So a large organisation is not the same as talking about a large church. It's not talking about a church that has 5 pastors on staff. It's talking about a church where there are at least 5 either paid staff or volunteers. In total, there are no more than 4 people, in fact, because once you reach 5, you are into the large category. So I think important that we recognise that. Okay, well, what are the next steps for you as a church? You've sat here patiently as I've rabbited on about this guidance in this brief introduction. Well, the first thing you need to do is that you need to understand the guidance. You need to grab hold of it. It's available on www.gov.uk. We have put the link into the PowerPoints that you've seen, and you can download this PowerPoint from our website as well. So it's available there, but if you just type into a search engine the title, Keeping Children Safe During Community Activities, After School Clubs and Tuition, look down within the first couple of lines on your search. You will see the .gov website, and click on through, and you can grab hold of all of these documents and download them there and then. So the first thing to say is you need to grab hold of the guidance. It may be that that's all that you need at this point, is you just need to know that it's there and where to get it, and that's great. Once you've got hold of the guidance and you've been through it, you've made sure you understand it, what we do need to do is make sure that we review our practice in line with this guidance. It is there as a minimum standard. Now, as I say, it may well be that that's a relatively quick process for you because you've got all the stuff in place. But just work your way through the sections, go through the checklists. Have we got all of this stuff in place? And if you haven't, develop a plan as to how you're going to implement this. And then the third thing that I would say in terms of next steps it is one that we've been encouraging churches to do for a long time in training, but it's that being proactive. The idea here is that we are encouraging parents to take responsibility, to raise questions, to look at, if I'm going to leave my kids at this church group, is it safe? And what we very much want to develop here is a proactive approach, so that we're ready to answer that, our workers are ready to answer that, we've got some basic documentation perhaps in place, or we've got stuff that's on our website that parents can download that just describes how do we meet these requirements. Although there's no regulatory framework here, it is being intended to be used as a voluntary code, a voluntary standard that says if this organisation is not meeting these minimum requirements, you need to think carefully about whether you're happy for your child to be there. So let's be proactive. Let's be promoting the fact that what we're doing is good quality, because for most of us, the work that we're doing on safeguarding is good quality. We've been thinking about this for a long time, haven't we? And so let's be proactive in holding that up. Now, it may be that some of you, when you start to look at this, you find that you need some additional support, or maybe you want some more detailed information than just this very quick overview that's superficial. It hasn't got into the depth of the guidance, obviously. We are in the process of putting together a significant amount of information for you on this guidance. As I said, it's not that it's new information for us. A lot of what we're doing is reformatting things that we've already got, but we are working hard to make sure that the way we're communicating these things to you is in line with the guidance, and it's easy to see how that fits. Starting next week, so starting literally the tail end of October, we are going to be delivering some webinars. These will be Zoom sessions that you will need to book into. There is a charge for those, I'm afraid. We are trying to keep that as cost effective as we can, so they're £10 per person, and you will get a couple of hours where we'll take you through that guidance in proper detail. It won't be overview stuff. We will take you through the guidance, what are the requirements, we'll work our way through the checklists and that kind of thing, so that you've got a real good solid understanding of what does this look like into the church context. So the webinars, you can book those through Eventbrite, or you can book those via our website, and you can see on the screen in front of you the details there. You can contact us at any point. We are also working on resources. Again, this isn't new stuff to us, it's just a case of reworking things so we're able to respond pretty quickly to this, and we anticipate that certainly by the end of next week, certainly by the end of October 2020, we will have resources specifically tailored and specifically constructed in line with this latest guidance. That you can download, that you can use, and those kinds of things. As always, we follow a particular pattern here at CSS. That pattern is we make a certain amount of information available free of charge to you. If you just need to know what do we need to do, that's great. You can have that information free of charge. If you need some more help in terms of template policies and those kinds of things, we do make a charge for that, and you can access those through one of our basic membership level, which is a cost of £60 per year. So we'll have those kinds of resources available for you within about a week. We also, of course, have ongoing training, ongoing development, ongoing support, and so we're able to support you with that as well. As a church, if you need some in-house training, we can deliver that for you. If you want to sign up for one of our online courses, you can do that. We also have a train the trainer module. So we've got lots of stuff in place, whether it's at the trustee level, whether it's the safeguarding lead level, whatever it is that you need. We have standard packages, and we can also, of course, develop bespoke training for you. Well, I hope that this webinar has been helpful and given you a little bit of a heads up. As I said, we will be putting out much more detailed information over the coming days. Those events on Eventbrite are already live. We haven't quite got them written yet, but they will be happening next week. We will have them all pulled together before that. The idea of this webinar, as I said at the beginning, was just to give you that overview so that you know that the guidance is there. You have a little bit of an overview of it. Of course, it may be that all you need to do is just download the guidance and get on with it. You might not need any more support, and that's great. We're glad to have been able to serve by drawing this to your attention. But if you do need some more support, please don't hesitate to contact us. Information on the website. You can email us, and you've got the contact details, or you can give us a call. And we'll happily do what we can to help you to understand this. This is an opportunity for us as churches just to review what we're doing, make sure that we're up to speed with latest thinking, and to make sure that we really are doing our safeguarding in a way that is glorifying to God, in a way that He would be pleased with, a way that reflects the heart of God, the love of God for those who are made in His image. We can embrace this guidance. We need to think through some issues about, how will we deal with that. But it is a good opportunity for us to approach safeguarding in a new way, or at least to refresh our view of it, to just revisit things in the light of this new guidance, so that we can make sure that we're doing the very best that we can to care for and to love those that we serve. Well, thank you for watching. I hope this information has been helpful to you. And as I say, if there are any questions, if there's any issues, please don't hesitate to make contact with us. And we are, as always, more than happy to support wherever we can. Thanks very much, folks.